Hey guys, this is W3C and today we want to look into a very common spot which will happen quite frequently in PKOs. You're sitting in the small blind, you cover the big blind very well. The big blind has in between 13 and 18 or 13 and 20 big blinds, and you have a decision here whether you want to jam, limp, raise. So you have three possible options. Folding is obviously out of the window, and I want to show you how to get close to an optimal solution. Of course, we don't have any pre-flop or post-flop solvers yet for PKO, so we cannot really tell exactly what will be like the perfect solution, but we can give a very good educated guess on how we want to play certain hands, certain hand categories, and we will get close to the optimal solution. The player here has a little bit over starting stack, so 1.2 starting stacks, since this is a Bounty Builder 109, and he has his start bounty on his head. This spot is of course also a little bit population dependent, and I will show you later on how to deviate from your strategy which you know for, let's say, low and mid stakes population if you play a high stakes tournament. To solve the spot, we essentially need to answer two questions. First question, what is the big blind calling for his tournament live here for 16 big blinds? This of course can vary in between the populations. High stakes players probably call a little bit closer to what is optimal Nash or probably even wider. Low stakes players might be a little bit tighter in this spot. And this of course influences our jam EV and decreases the EV of a limp in comparison. So jam might be for some combinations, if the big blind calls a little bit less, way more profitable than limp, and so we want to jam more. The second question which we want to answer is not so easy to answer actually. How big is the EV of a limp? And since we don't have a solver, we cannot really tell exactly. But we know from non-KO solutions that a lot of the combinations will have an equity realization below 1. Means since you're out of position, realizing the equity of a hand for, let's say, Queen 3 offsuit is pretty hard. So if we find combinations which are close in EV to a limp in a jam, or even better in a jam compared to a limp, then we should most likely go for the jam and not for the limp, for all the combinations which suffer in realizing their equity out of position. Now let us look into the solutions. Alright, so here I have the first solution, and this is the solution against the high stakes playing population. I will show you first the ranges which I did use. So this is our standard limping range in a non-KO tournament. We will limp a lot of the suited aces, suited kings. Here in the suited range, we will limp fold some parts of our limping range here. Same goes for the offsuited part here at the bottom. And then we will jam. And those combinations are usually not in a jam, but here all of those combos you want to jam first in for a stack size of 15 BB. You can also simplify this here for this spot for a stack size of 16 BB. Now, if we choose this 35% jamming range, the optimal decision in the big blind is to call this range here. So King 7 offsuit, Ace Deuce offsuit, Ace Deuce suited, leave out King 3 and King Deuce since they don't have sufficient equity. I will show you this in a second. And basically all the 8x suited combinations down to 9-8 suited. Also Queen 9 offsuit, partly 10-9 offsuit, which is a close combination. And Jack 9, since it's only played 18% of the times here, should be a fold or very close combination. We will have also, if we do limp in the small blind, look into the jamming range of the big blind, and you will see, if you compare this to the range in the TMC, that this is already a little bit wider in their estimation. I think that players in the PKOs will understand in the high stakes tournament that their range should be increased, especially in the high cards. So probably even King 9 is inside, Probably Queen Jack is inside. I was not very certain. So I took the 15 BB rejamming range out of the big blind against the small blind limp and just increase a little bit in the King X, decrease a little bit in the Queen X combinations. Here I took the combination fully. We have 16 big blinds, so players are probably inclined to check back a little bit more than this, but this is my overall estimation of the jamming range. And now we have the EVs of all the combinations. So we can compare the EV of a limp here of those combinations to the EV of a jam here. And we might find sufficient combinations where a jam just prints against a very good calling range here, still more than a limp. So let's look, for example, at a hand of 7-4 suited. 7-4 suited prints in a jam 0.15, which is essentially $4. If you look here at the 7-4 suited, it's printing essentially $3. So you make $1 more by jamming here. This is a combination which you usually want to limp and then call versus a 3.5x out of the big blind and fold versus a jam. Well, here in the PKO, it's a clear plus EV jam, and not only that's a clear plus EV jam, it's also better than limping, and realizing the equity of this combination is also below 1, so the equity realization of this combination is below 1, so jamming has way higher EV than limping, so we would in the PKO just open jam this combination here. And we can now do this for the whole grid, so we export all the EV numbers and then calculate the differences in EV between limping and jamming, and we will find combinations which are clear better jam than a limp compared to our non-KO strategy. The resulting jamming range I will show you in a second in the range viewer, but first of all I want to make you aware that again those suited kings here are in general a fold. Meanwhile 9-8 suited is a call against the chosen jamming range, which is not much deviating from the jamming range we would choose in a non-KO tournament. Just some more little off-suited combinations are inside of this jamming range. And you might be very surprised that King 3 and King Deuce is a close fold, also King 6, so all of the high cards which are usually a snap call in the calling ranges of the high stakes racks I did ask are actually here close minus EV calling combinations, and we can easily verify this. So we need here, if we are in the big blind, around about 46% equity. Now we can just take our combinations here, which we want to jam or did choose to jam in HRC, and we can calculate the equity. And if we take King 3 suited, then we will not have the 46% which we need. So King 3 suited is just a fold. Same goes for King 6 offsuit. King 7 should have a little bit over 47% here, I think. Yeah, 47%. So King 7 offsuit should be then clearly inside of the calling range, and it is inside of the calling range. So be a little bit tighter here in the suited kings. We can go a little bit further ahead and take card bunching into account. So this is Monte Carlo sim here, which uses a fixed small blind jamming range. It's a little bit different to the small blind jamming range which I did use before in the sim, but it's close to the same jamming range. And if you look into the calls here, you should be even a little bit tighter. So we have here 32% calling range. We even fold King 7, King 4 suited, and 9-8 suited is now a clear fold, since the effective density of the top range here, so the ace-x combinations and the pairs, is highly increased since everyone before the position of the small blind did open fold. So be aware that if you do run the full simulation with card bunching, your big blind defending range is becoming even a little bit tighter. Now back to the first sim and what we can learn for the EVs of limping compared to jamming. Here I did prepare the solution for jamming against limping. So you can see here the jam EV in green, which is bigger than 0.05 table equity compared to a limp. So a limp might be plus EV here, and the jam is even better than a limp for 0.05 table equity. If you wonder what table equity is, it's essentially the share on the whole price pool on your table. So if your table has XY in chips and XY in bounties on your table, then your table will be compared to the whole field with the total amount of chips in play and the total price pool in play have some share on this whole price pool. And HSC calculates the change of the shares on the price pools for every stack. This is how a dollar EV calculation works. And if it's stated 0.05 table equity more, it means, for example, in our case, let's look into jam here, 0.05 difference we have here in 10.5 and 10.6. So 10.5 makes $4, 10.6 makes $5.50. So in this case here, a table equity difference of 0.05 is essentially a difference of $1.50 in EV. Go back to the solution here and let's look at all the combinations. Of course, you don't want to jam your top range. Since you want the big blind to realize this equity in a check back, you want to let the big blind rejam, you want to let the big blind raise so that we can call. But all of the other combinations shown in green, regardless if we are taking top range inside or not, are very, very profitable jams here. All the jam EVs make you at least $1.50 more compared to a limp. And we have a lot of combinations inside which actually suffer in realizing the equity. For example, King 4 suited, for example, 8-5 suited. Question is, how big is actually the deviation of a jamming range in a high stakes pool compared to a non-KO? And you can see where we want to increase our range. And this is mostly in the yellow combinations. So all of the yellow combinations will print you, let's say on average, $1 more in the jam. And all of those combinations are clearly not a jam in a non-KO. Especially here in the offsuited connectors, in the lower offsuited kings, and also here in your usual limp calls against 3x and limp folds against the jam. So this square here, you want to just jam. It's just too much EV in those combinations not to take the jam. So our overall jamming range is here 51%. If we take out the top range, then our overall jamming range is round about 46%. Now this is how we want to deviate from our non-KO strategy in a field where players are playing close to optimal, probably even calling a little bit more in the big blind than they are supposed to call, especially in the suited low king X and the off-suited king X. How much can we deviate in a population which will definitely undercall? And I don't only want to say this, I show you my population analysis on the database I have. Obviously my database is not super big, but it should give you a good idea. So this is the calling range of the big blind against the first in jam from the small blind, and the big blind has in between 13 and 18 big blinds. And you can see that pairs are called. Probably every suited king is called, since king 8 suited has 8 situations. I had no situation on king 4, but it's, I think, safe to say that most of the suited kings are called against the jam, and probably down to king 6. So all the suited kings, king 6. Where you can see a big deviation is here. So I think especially in the queen 9, jack 9, 10 9 combinations, players are not calling. In the 8x suited combinations, players are not calling. Probably even here, probably I don't have sufficient hands, but you can clearly see that the number of calls in the suited queens is also dropping significantly compared to the good range here. I did also ask some low stakes players what they would call for 16 big blinds in the big blind, and this is what I want to show you here in the second solution. So this is the cumulated range which I got from several low stakes players. Some were calling a little bit wider in the suited kings, some were only calling king 9 suited, some were calling king 10, some were folding king 10, but overall this is on average the answer which I got when I did ask low or low mid stakes players what would you call for 16 big blinds and your tournament live in the big blind when the small blind jams on you, small blind covers you well, and you have a start bounty on your head, have a start stack. This is the overall calling range on average which I got, which is, to be fair, a little bit tighter than what my population analysis did show, but the population analysis was for in between 13 and 18 big blinds, so you can estimate that if the stack size is getting a little bit lower in the big blind, so if the big blind had 14 big blinds or 13, then the suited kings are called more often. For 16 big blinds, or 15 big blinds, or 18 big blinds, I think the suited kings here, especially in the low suited kings and in the off suited king range, are folded a little bit more often. And if a player is calling against your jam, only this range, then we will see a big deviation in the strategy if we compare a KO to a non-KO tournament. Just to give you a little example here. So here we have the EVs of our first in jam if the big blind is calling only 27%. And you can see that, for example, 9-5 suited here, or let's take 9-4 suited, is printing 0.23 table equity, or a little bit over $6. Now, if we are comparing this to a limp, the 9-4 suited here is only printing in a limp $3.30. So you nearly double the EV of 9-4 suited if you jam 9-4 suited, and again, in the limp, we will have 100% equity realization here in HSC, since post-flop HSC will check down and you will realize 100% of your equity. For 9-4 suited, it's definitely safe to say that out of position in a small blind, you will not realize 100% of your equity. So jamming is even better. You can take again all of the EVs of the limp and of the jam and compare the EVs against each other, and you will get a new strategy. This is the strategy here. In blue, I do show the combinations which you're jamming anyway in a non-KO. And the green range is the additional profitable range. And here in green, you have not 0.05 table equity, but 0.1 table equity, which is $3 difference compared to a limp. And you can see, especially here in the suited range, you want to safely jam way more. Also in the off-suited one gappers, you want to jam safely more. And if you look into the combinations which make at least $1.50 more, you add also the yellow range. We end up with a jamming range of 75%. Oh, just see here the aces are of course not the jam. This is a mistake in the coloring, so yeah, it should be only ace king. Just think about that this ace will be usually not inside of our jamming range. Here in the red combinations, I give you also an example of how you want to deviate. So in a non-KO, you would raise fold those combinations. And to calculate the EV of raise folding is actually not so easy. So I simplify here the analysis and say I would usually just limp those combinations. And if you compare again those combinations in a limp to a jam, then the jam will net you for those combinations $3 more compared to a limp. Is raise folding better? Well, if the big blind is reacting very tight against your raises, only jams his nutted range, probably even overfold against the raise. Of course, you can deviate from your jamming strategy and want to shift your strategy to a raising strategy for the lower hands here, since you can always exploit the population's strategy if they jam only nuts and you will have to fold. You can also see this here in the limp. So if the big blind will jam his 28%, then your calling range drops down to 17% compared to your limping range. You did limp here all the good range and all of the suited hands, and of course a hand like 9-4 suited here is a clear fold if the big blind chooses to jam close to optimally. If the big blind jams even tighter, then of course your calling range here is getting also tighter and the EVs are dropping for your lower suited hands. So the obvious exploit on a population, if you have a tight player in a low stakes population, is to raise and not to jam a lot of those combinations. Now looking in the end back into my hand, I did mark the spot since I was very uncertain if I want to jam or if I want to limp this combination, and I must say that jamming here is not so good against the higher stakes population. This guy's a wreck on the higher stakes population, and from the analysis against the high stakes players here, Queen 3 makes 0.16 in a limp if they have a very inelastic jamming range compared to a non-KO, so they take this jamming range here, and the jam is just not printing enough compared to the limp, so I should just limp this hand here. The player here did call and wins with a7. So this is the spot I wanted to present today. Especially the deviation against low and mid stakes population is enormous in this spot versus high stakes. You can add a couple of combinations, especially here in the off-suited range. You want to be wider in your jams. Hope you took something away. Good luck at the tables, guys. See you there and bye bye.